again, my name is Brother Nathan Linton, and welcome to Superior Disciple. In my last video, we started to talk about the life of St. Francis of Assisi, and specifically we started to talk about his life prior to his conversion. There's a very interesting story about a man who really lived an extravagant life, a party life. But today we finally get to start talking about Francis in the midst of his conversion. A man experiencing struggle and unsurety, but we get to see how God intervenes in the life of this man, who I find so inspiring, and who I think continues to inspire the Church, and certainly continues to inspire our Holy Father, Pope Francis. So we're going to begin by, picking up where we left off. St. Francis, or the not-so-saintly Francis, living a life striving for the glory and the honor of the world, striving to gain this fame and notoriety by living his life as a knight. This was something that Francis longed for. He wanted the glory and the honor of knighthood. And he tried. He was, again, from a wealthy family, so he was able to get all of the armor and the war horse that was needed to become a knight, and to strive after this life and to gain honor. And so he went with the army from Assisi to battle against the neighboring town of Perugia. But Assisi lost the battle, and Francis was captured, and he was actually imprisoned in the dungeons of Perugia, basically kept as a prisoner of war. Of course, if you're thinking of prisons like they are today, that certainly wasn't the case. So Francis was pretty much in squalor in these cells at the bottom of the city, which was very dirty, very messy. And it wasn't exactly a fun time, although our sources tell us that Francis was a kind of an inspiration for the men already in prison, as he tried to keep things light and lively in the midst of this suffering and in the midst of this kind of depressing and unenjoyable existence as a prisoner of war. But being from a wealthy family, Francis's father, Pietro, was able to pay the ransom that Perugia was asking, and Francis was able to return home. However, he was sick because of the conditions in the prison, in the dungeons in which he was kept. But he wasn't done yet. This didn't discourage Francis. Although he had some time to reflect and things started to shift interiorly during his sickness, he still wanted that which was glorious. He still wanted the glory and the honor of the world. And so he tried a second chance at knighthood. Francis again joined the army of Assisi and was going with them to fight against, again, a neighboring town of Apulia. But on the march toward Apulia, as they were camped out one night, Francis had a dream. And in this dream, he saw this beautiful tower, and this tower was filled with the finest arms and armor, beautiful shields and beautiful swords. And Francis wanted these things, and he wanted this glory. But he heard this voice say to him, "Francis, is it better to serve the servant or to serve the master?" And Francis, of course, said, "It's better to serve the master." And when he woke up, Francis began to realize that no matter what it was that he did, no matter who it was on earth that he was serving, whether it was the mayor of Assisi or whether it was a king or an emperor, it didn't matter. He would still only be serving the servant. He started to realize and to recognize this calling to serve the true master, to serve his God, our God in heaven. So Francis did not continue on the march to Apulia, but he returned home to Assisi. And he started to do these crazy things. He wasn't quite behaving like himself anymore. He was known to give extravagantly to the lepers, to the poor and to the beggars. And he would actually take his father's cloth. Remember, his father Pietro was a cloth merchant, and that's why the family was so wealthy. He would take his cloth to neighboring cities, and he would sell the cloth, and he would take the gold, and he would distribute the gold to the poor and to the suffering. But his father Pietro wasn't too happy about this, and actually at one point even locked him again in this basically prison cell that they had in their house. Now, it was the father's right at that time to do so, but it wasn't a great thing. Can you imagine that? I mean, he's maybe in his early 20s at this point, and he's already been imprisoned twice. Doesn't exactly strike you as our normal model of holiness, but I think that's part of what makes Francis's life so beautiful. But of course, his mother Pico was very loving and, was let him out of the prison, and things kind of continued in that way. But one day, Francis was out, walking in the fields around Assisi. And if you remember last time, I talked about the structure of Assisi as being built up upon this hill, on the side of this hill. And so the rich lived at the top of the hill, where it was safe, where it was clean. And then as you got poorer and poorer, you ended up at the bottom of the hill, where all of the dirty water, all of the runoff flowed, where it was not quite as safe as up by the top of the hill, closer to the Rocca Maggiore, the great castle on the top of the hill. But if you were so poor, or if you were an outcast, you would be outside of the city walls. And this is where Francis was walking, the fields outside of the city walls. And it was while he was walking that he met a leper. He met someone with leprosy, whose skin had began to rot. And Francis did not like lepers up until this point. He saw them as dirty, he saw them as diseased, and he was afraid of them. And he wouldn't go near them. He wanted to be as far away from the lepers as possible, because they were dirty and they were basically subhuman. But this was different. Francis tells us this in his testament, which is his sort of autobiography. It's a very short document, and as Capuchins we actually keep it at the front of our constitutions as sort of the spiritual kind of preamble to our way of life, along with the rule of St. Francis. But in his testament, Francis tells us this: "The Lord gave me, Brother Francis, thus to begin doing penance in this way. For when I was in sin, it seemed too bitter for me to see lepers, and the Lord himself led me among them, and I showed mercy to them. And when I left them, what had seemed bitter to me was turned into sweetness of soul and body." This encounter with the leper changed him. In other accounts of Francis's encounter with the leper, we see Francis not only seeing this leper, but we get a fuller story. Francis not only sees this leper along the way, but despite his fear and hesitation, yes, shows mercy to them, but goes and embraces this leper with a hug, with a kiss to the hand, giving them gold, seeing them as an equal. This is a beautiful thing. And this is what changes St. Francis. It was through his encounter with God in his dream on the way to Apulia, and it was through his encounter with the leper on the roads outside of Assisi that Francis began to open his heart to the call of God. And we see this phrase, this call to encounter, show up constantly in the papacy of Pope Francis, who of course takes his name after St. Francis of Assisi. Why? Because, like in the time of St. Francis, Pope Francis is looking out into the world and seeing that this structure has again risen up, where the rich are at the top and the poor are at the bottom, and the outcasts are seen not as brothers and sisters in Christ, but as not even worthy of concern. And so Pope Francis encourages us to follow the example of Christ and the example of St. Francis of Assisi by going out of our comfort zone, by going outside of the city walls and the walls which we have built up for ourselves, and encountering the poor and the marginalized, the suffering, those who we don't necessarily want to be with, especially those who we don't necessarily see ourselves as equals with. Because when we encounter them, when we meet them face to face, we learn that they are our brothers and sisters, that they, just like us, are beloved by Christ, who has created us all for his goodness. May we continue to strive after the path of Christ, and like St. Francis, in doing so, may what we saw as bitter become sweetness of soul and of body. Again, my name is Brother Nathan Linton, and I thank you for joining me here at Superior Disciple. May God bless you and keep you this holiday season.